You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Well, welcome back to the 95 Podcast, everyone. I'm Dale Sellers, Executive Director of 95 Network, and I'm so thankful that you're with us today. Now that we're in a new year and all the past difficulties and hardships have all left us behind. Actually, that's probably not true. But anyway, thank God we're in a new year, and I've got a great guest with me today. George Kreger is with me today, and I'm just really excited. He's got a ministry that's going to help all you churches and everybody that's in any kind of area of ministry, but we're going to get to that a little later. But first, I just want to kind of get to know his story and learn a little bit about him. And actually, he's a friend of mine that I met through John Sanders, our teammate here. And I think, George, you told me you were originally on John's podcast. Is that correct?
I was. John and Travis Stevens contacted me at some point, and just kind of turned into where I did a podcast with John.
Well, if John and Travis are your friends, then you're my friend. So welcome to the 95 Podcast.
I'm glad to be here. I've been looking forward to this all weekend.
Now, where do you live?
Well, I live in Bryan, Ohio. Now, Ohio has many counties, and we are the county in the northwest corner of Ohio. So we are literally 15 minutes from Michigan, 15 minutes from Indiana. We're in the county seat, Bryan, Ohio, of Williams County. We're kind of on a line between Toledo, Ohio, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. Very agrarian, agricultural county. Total county has 40,000 people. Our town has about 8,000 people. So this is where I've been for the last 3 decades.
Have you ever heard of Stryker, Ohio?
I know exactly. A Stryker is 6-7 minutes from me. And
I thought it might be.
Been there many times.
Had a pastor at a church many, many years ago that we were part of, what they called a new pastor, and he was from Stryker, Ohio.
Well,
how about that small world, huh?
That's a small town. That's a town of like 900.
Yeah. And he had a large church there too back in the day. So anyway, well, I'd love for you to take a moment and just kind of tell us your story, a little bit about about your ministry experience, and then we're going to at the end of the podcast, or later in the podcast, I should say, at the end. But we want to dive into what you're doing today to help churches. But first of all, kind of tell us your story.
Okay. Well, John. Dale, I was called to ministry when I was 16 years old. Had I think kind of a dramatic call. And myself and my good friend Tim Hughes, we were at a thing down in Oklahoma, and we were 16 years old, and we were both called. And so that began the journey, eventually to Lincoln Christian College in Illinois. I was from Iowa, but that's where I went to college, and then the seminary. That would be back in 72 to 79. And I met my wife, Deb, there. She was from Toledo, Ohio. So we live in Ohio, as you know how those things,
yes, sir.
Those things work. So, but in 1979, we had left seminary. We had a son who was 6 months old, and we moved out to a little town called Pioneer, Ohio, which is directly north of where I live now, about 20 minutes. Just before you get to the Michigan line, actually. And it was a church, kind of a church plant in some ways. But, I was 24 years old. I was green as grass. I didn't know what to ask, anything. Sure. I moved my family there. They told me I had to get a job. I got a job driving truck. I was making $105 a week.
Woo,
and I didn't realize that, they'd been through 2 other ministers over the previous 2 years.
They don't tell you that.
They don't. And
in my book, I talk about this. I'm just going to be honest with you. Most of the time, search committees just kind of either omit or lie. They just don't mention a lot of things.
Yeah, and I didn't know to ask, and so we moved there, and I was fortunate to get this position. I was driving truck, but there, just a sort of box truck that went to towns 50, 60, 80 miles away, but was always back each night. So that's what I was doing, working at the church. And it was a learning experience. I'd never done anything like this. I wasn't raised in a pastor's home, anything of that nature. And I found out they had these 3 elders, and 2 of them were father and son. And this father had been at every Christian church in the county before this, and so it was a little bit of a. It was in the end. It's one of the best things that happened to me because I
little
learned
culture shock though.
culture shock, but I
Now, is this
learned.
the early '80s? Is this when this is happening? Early '80s?
This is 79, 80,
Yeah.
81. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So essentially, I left there in 82. Was still there driving trucks, so I had income, and I was thinking I'm going to go get a full-time position somewhere. But there was a church up in Michigan, about 7 miles from my house, that a lady I worked with at the factory that was in the office. She asked if I'd come preach there, and I went up there and I preached, and I don't know. One thing led to another, and I ended up in another part-time bivocational situation at this church. It wasn't part of my background, the Christian church. It was a small denomination, but it was a great church. I mean, a great people, just a small church, and on a third of an acre in the country in Hillsdale County. But it was good people, and good experience. And I met another pastor during that time named Bruce. He had two small churches. He had what was called a circuit, where he was preaching at both, and they were supporting him. One was actually in Pioneer, another one was a little bit west of there. And we became friends, and we started talking about doing something together. And we're up to about 1984 now. And what we did was we didn't talk about this earlier, but we merged these three churches. And this was before mergers were out there as much.
Let's just go ahead and establish everything you're going to mention today was before we do anything we do now. It wasn't church planning back then. It wasn't mergers back then. None of that stuff. This is way back today, man.
So in 80, we acquired this property. We sold farms. We sold different assets. We built a building. We got into it in fall of 1987. And this was my first real experience with building. I mean, I designed the building. I drew it out. I kind of ran the whole project. And
was that in your background?
My dad was a contractor, but no, not really. Not really. But I enjoyed it, and it worked well. We got into that building in November of 1985. We were running about 90 people. We lost some people through a merger, as you might expect.
Sure.
We don't like that. We don't want to do that. That would be betraying our parents.
It'd be betraying what we want.
Yeah.
Let's just be honest.
So, but God was gracious to us. We got in, and within less than 2 years, we were running 300. We were just having a great time, and I was very happy.
Did you say you're out in the country?
Out in the country, yeah,
okay.
Very much.
And he's running 300 people out in the country. Imagine that.
Yeah. It was, and the denomination I was a part of came to me and said, George, we got two pastors at this church. I mean, you and Bruce, and we've got other churches that need a pastor. Would you consider going full time? And they basically mentioned three churches. One was in South Bend, Indiana. Another was in Hillsdale, Michigan. Another one was in Coldwater, Michigan. And I said, well, I'll think about it. And literally, Dale, within the next day or two, I was driving down a road, driving truck, and I came down a road, Highway 127, which runs right by our subdivision. And I looked to the right, and there was this little church back in the subdivision. I mean, no highway access. And I had one of those moments, no audible voice, nothing like that, but just a sense that's where you're going. That's where you're going. I didn't even know what the church was.
Yeah.
And when the committee called me back and said, George, would you, what are you thinking? I said, well, I've been thinking about it, but the funny thing was there's this one church that just kind of came to mind more than those three that you asked me about. And the guy literally said, would it be Brian? And unbeknownst to me, the older guy that was pastoring this little church of 50 people was leaving. Mm-hmm. And they asked me, they said that was now open, and would I be interested in it?
And that was close to where you were living?
20 minutes south. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
20 minutes south.
Okay.
So we basically decided to take the jump. They had never supported a pastor full time. I had never been a full-time pastor. And so we just kind of took a chance on each other. And
did you say it was in a subdivision?
Subdivision. It was outside the city limits of Bryan, the town limits. The subdivision had been developed.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, the house we lived in had been the farmhouse for that entire area at one time. So it was a very old home.
Mm-hmm.
We had bats in the basement and all sorts of things
Been there, done that.
that were crazy.
Yeah, that ain't fun.
So that was 1987. Moved down August of 1987. Just hoping that they would be able to pay me more or less. And even though I'd been part-time in ministry, you just don't do a lot of things when you're bivocational. There's a lot of areas
you so
have to
hard.
say no to. So now I'm learning. I think I'm 32 at this point. And we started to see some visitors. There were 28 churches in Bryan with a Bryan zip code, town of 8,000. And we'd get some visitors, and it would kind of stick, And a lot of the churches were mainline or parochial, Catholic, Lutheran, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But we began to see a little bit of growth, and that was exciting to me. And over the next 2, 3, 4 years, that kept happening. We could hold about 150 if we were packed in. It was just a 4,000 square foot building.
Yeah.
And so then we tried 2 services, which it wasn't the best, but we tried. Yeah. And then we decided, then I just had the thought we should try to build what we need. And then if we can't make it happen, so be it. At least we tried. And kind of the what if, I'll never have to ask what if I would have tried that. And we decided to build it ourselves to save money. It was a $750,000 project, moving us from 4,000, adding another 14,000 square feet. And we broke ground on Easter of 1993, I think it was. And I told the congregation we would be in by Christmas. I was later glad I didn't tell them what Christmas.
I was going to say, I grew up building, and so I've been around many churches that will make declarations of, by this time we'll do this. I'm like, I don't do that.
It was a 500-day project. I'm telling you, I mean, I lived right by it, so I was there most of those days. We did the roof. We did, all sorts of neat stories from that time. It was a struggle, but it was also good. And we got in and had the dedication. I remember in November of the year after so a year and a half after and I'll never forget after that dedication, we had just had a great time. And I don't get sick. And I got sick the next week. And I was sick. My body it was an experience I'd never had.
I imagine most of the people listening right now are shaking their head going, I know exactly what you're talking about, because you push. And then when it's time to catch your breath, you realize, man, I'm in bad shape. Yep.
So we started seeing some good things happen now that we had room, and just kept, seeing some increase in numbers. We got rid of the parsonage that I lived in, which was out front, blocking the view. And so we contracted with the fire department. I had to buy a house, by the way, or I had to get a house first before they could do that.
Yes.
And we contracted with the fire department to take the house down, but they wanted to practice for a while. They'd smoke it out, and then they haul out a dummy, And so the rumors went around town, that
you died.
Something happened to that poor preacher out there. And
then he built that building and then he burned out.
They practiced again. They thought, how could that happen again to the same guy? So eventually it tore down. And for many people, it was like this church miraculously appeared.
Yeah, they hadn't seen it.
And now we started really getting the traffic flow. And so from that time for the next 8 years or so, we did the thing. We had chairs, of course. So we added chairs and squeezed them together as we grew. And then eventually we did a second service and we got rid of some chairs and spaced it out. So we always kind of had that full feel, and eventually filled that up. And then we went to a third service. And so I was now preaching 3 times every Sunday morning. And we were running, 900 to 1,000 during our high point, and just adding, learning about hiring and firing and all of that sort of dynamics. And then we added on to that building, and then we had acquired 6 acres in our subdivision right across a road from us, and we built the North Campus, which added another 30,000 square feet, which was a big full-size gym.
Y'all build that yourself too?
No, this one was
Contract that one?
interesting. We said this one we're going to hire a general contractor. So we hired a general contractor. We broke ground on Easter. I told the congregation we'd be in by Christmas. I'm a slow learner. And the general contractor.
Didn't you just say that 10 minutes ago?
I know. But the general contractor came down ill halfway through the project, got a brain tumor and died.
Oh my goodness.
In just a few weeks, and found out he hadn't been paying some of the subs. And, we went through all the headaches of that. But God got us through it. We had good people. And, this was a couple $1 million project. And again, we were always committed to building debt free. I should have mentioned that earlier, but I had heard, I should have probably mentioned back in 1984, 1985, I went to something that I'd never been to. I went to a John Maxwell leadership thing. Okay. And, and it just changed my outlook on a lot of things, it was fun, it was interesting, and it got me thinking in areas that I hadn't really ever thought in. So, but one of the things I remember him saying was, the last thing I'm going to do is build a building and then spend the next 15 years focused on paying for it. Yep. And for whatever reason, that stuck with me. And so we were committed. We put off building if we couldn't. And so we kept that happening. And we got into that building probably in 2005. And now we had all sorts of, children's ministry features. And, we went early on, you only have so many things that capture people, whether it's the preaching or the friendliness of the congregation or things. But as you grow, you add staff who make their areas attractive. And so now we had a worship thing that was attractive to people. We had a children's ministry that was attractive, a student ministry that was attractive. So you get more front doors coming in for people, and we would just see a lot of that happen. Now, what's interesting in a small town, when I came to town, I was just one of 28 churches, and nobody really cared. When we became the largest church by multiples over time, some people rejoiced and some people didn't. We were the things that would be said. People would come to churches in town looking for transients, looking for help, and so on. Well, go out there and see George, and they got all the money, that sort of thing, which is just not true. But there were also people that were there were also pastors that rejoiced, so you just that, that's how it goes. And so we've continued with that ministry. Part of, what I need to mention about 2005 is when we built that big building, we needed 1,000 chairs and 100 tables. And that's what got me into the business that I do, the ministry that I have. But I'll share a little bit about that later. But that's a time frame from a context standpoint. And so we continue along. During this time, the town itself began to experience some drawbacks. We had a lot of first generation industry. It moved on to second generation. Now it's third generation. Things like Brian had the Ohio Art Company, which made the Etch-a-Sketch and all sorts of things that. Brian Ohio. Spangler Candy Company did the Dum-Dums, and General Tire and just a lot of big homegrown industry, but they would be sold out and move the corporates away from town. We started seeing school enrollments drop. The town is building drugstores and nursing homes or retirement homes, and
the demographic starts changing.
The census is showing an aging population. And it began to, we were kind of at saturation. When you've got, you're in a town of 8,000, a town of county of 40,000, and you've got, pushing 2,000 people in that calling this their church. Yeah. That's a high rate of saturation. And so it began to be that I'm just not sure what the next step is. I don't know that I want to do multi-campus. The towns, we were too far out to be a bedroom community from Toledo, Ohio. So the smaller towns around us were only in worse shape with downtowns that were boarded up and so on. So I began to talk with my elders about the next step for the church and so on. And that turned into over a period of time, a succession plan. We used the Vanderblumen group in our case, but it's a struggle to do that in a smaller community. A lot of people don't want to live in that sort of thing. So it was a challenge. All sorts of things we could talk about what I learned in that. But a few years ago, I essentially turned it over to my successor, the church, and I said, "What am I going to do?" And that's when I said, "I'm just going to do far more with helping churches with what I do as a ministry." So
before we move into what you're doing now, and talk about your succession plan a little bit. How long did you? First of all, how did you come up with the idea to have it? I think this is important because a lot of churches don't. And then how did it go?
Well, I had a mentor in ministry for me was a guy named Bob Russell from Southeast Christian, and he had written a book on transitioning. And so when we began to talk about a succession plan, I purchased his book for each of our elders, and they read that. One of our elders was actually acquainted with William Vanderblumen of the Vanderblumen, and so he contacted him about heading up a succession plan for us. I'm not sure, everyone was committed that that's how we should do it, because it's, using a headhunter versus kind of the principle that maybe God will provide that person.
Sure.
But it was not my call to make. And I was able to express my opinion, but we went down that road. I knew it was going to be hard to get somebody that we wanted to come to this town because I knew how the medical community in town struggled to recruit doctors. I knew how the business community struggled to get people to come.
I knew town basically had plateaued. It was on the downside of the curve, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and the city life was attractive in that time, and even spouses and children of these people that we're trying to recruit, they want to live in a small town? If it's not their background, it's hard to. So it took. We kind of had a 2-year plan, and it just took a lot longer with the getting my successor. In fact, in some ways, I think the elders were a little pressured because they went out with this, and we kind of got to the point where maybe they settled prematurely for my successor versus extending the time period. And the guy who came, good guy, very, very much in common with me theologically and friendly and a good speaker, but
he wasn't you.
It just, there were 5 people in the church that preceded me from 1987. So it's a big change.
And how long have you been there total now by that time?
At that point, almost 3 decades.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to follow I always say the next person is the sacrificial lamb.
Yeah, and we understood that principle, and he ended up being that. And he moved on. And,
how long did he last?
Less than 2 years.
Yeah. And even though he was gifted, good, and everything, he wasn't you. And he just, so it's tough. So what happens after that?
There was a guy that probably lived about 2 hours from here that had been a youth pastor at a church similar to Bryan, Ohio. And somehow he got in the mix. I was gone at this point, and he came, and he's a hard worker. He fits the community, and the church has done pretty well, as I understand. I don't attend there.
Sure.
We're gone a lot, and I just never wanted to be that guy.
It's best for the church that you don't. I keep hearing people say, "Oh, it can work." It can, but most of the time it doesn't.
So I take him to breakfast, not as much as I should, but we get together 1 or 2 times a year or something. I just have a quick breakfast and pray for him, and it hasn't been hard for me to release. Yeah, it really is. I mean, I did one wedding after I left there. I agreed to do one wedding, and it convinced me that I'll never do another one.
Sure.
And I turned down funerals.
Your buddy John Maxwell said that when you leave a place, you leave it. You don't go back and do weddings. You don't go back and do funerals because people won't let you go. So, and the reason I want to spend this much time talking about, I want everybody to understand your background as we talk about what you're doing today, because I want them to understand you experienced all the ups and downs, ins and outs of rural church ministry, of one that grew, one that plateaued. And it wasn't, sometimes plateauing happens not because of you or the church, it's just the area around you, to have people to draw from. So I wanted everybody to know that background. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break, and then I want to kind of come back and talk about what you're doing today and how you help churches. So let's do that. We'll be right back.
Okay, that's great.
Well, we're back with George Kreger from Bryan, Ohio, talking today about what God's doing in his life. So you pastored the church, you transitioned, you handed it off, you left it in good shape. They went through the sacrificial lamb next pastor, but church is doing well today. What are you doing today?
Well, after I stepped back, I had been, if I jump back into 2005, which was, a decade before I left New Hope, that's when we needed 1,000 chairs and 100 tables for our new facility.
Let me just interject right there. When I pastored our small church, that was the biggest shock of my life was buying chairs, because I was just like, well, we'll just buy a couple hundred chairs and chairs are expensive. So we ended up, I told you when I talked to you last week, we ended up going to Walmart, or excuse me, Sam's Club, and buying the $24 burgundy stack chairs, and we made those work. Those things, even those were $24 a piece. That's a lot of money.
It is. And, I had worked with a place, going all the way back to my Lakeview days up there in Michigan, okay? The same place out of Toledo, I had bought furniture from them for years. And so now I needed a lot, and they sent down a guy to quote it versus normally me just ordering it.
Yeah.
And I remember they quoted $42,000. That's what it was.
For chairs.
For the chairs and the tables. And my son had started a business. He was in advertising, and he was getting vendors. He was signing up to be able to sell products from different places. And I said, Jason, call this manufacturer and see if they'll let you sell chairs. And he did. And for some reason, this place, Midwest Folding, they're even out of business now, out of Chicago, but they let him. And so even at entry-level pricing, we ended up buying that exact same stuff. Came on the same truck, came from the same factory, we ended up buying it for $29,000. And
oh, wow.
That got my attention, Dale. Now, that was extreme. And I think now that I'm a little disappointed that the place in Toledo was charging me that much. Sometimes places you do business with regularly get to taking you for granted, and they see you as they can get more from you versus they can take advantage of that relationship. Not everyone does, but I've learned that
we've got a strategic partner that helps out with churches getting sound systems. And one of the, and their passion is to serve the small and mid-sized church with audio-visual stuff. And part of that came from something very similar to what you're talking about, where a church that this particular guy was working with got a $100,000 quote on some equipment they needed. And this particular gentleman was able to get that same stuff for less than $20,000. And it's just like, okay, what's happening here? So I understand completely what you're saying.
Yeah. And so a lot of times, a place, when you start out with them, they can be very, put their best foot forward. But the challenge is for them to, after you've been working with them multiple times over 2 years, to be just as aggressive for your business.
Sure.
That's, pastors, we can be naive. We can be a little believing the best in people.
Well, pastors are trained to do ministry. And so, again, that's why probably the thing that altered your trajectory in life was coming into contact with John Maxwell in 1984, because he was talking about things then that nobody was talking about. Seminary prepares you to preach and to pray and how to do, study the Greek and the Hebrew, but it doesn't teach you how to have board meetings. It doesn't teach you how to do a lot of the things. And when you're in a building project in a church, often you're the general contractor too. And most pastors haven't been trained to do that. They certainly haven't been trained to buy stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So we needed some other furnishings. I asked my son to try the same thing. The manufacturer said, "You're in advertising. Why would we make you a dealer for furnishing?" So I'm learning, as I go. So essentially over the next months, I set up a company just so I could be legitimate to be able to do this. And my company, I had to have a name, so I can't. My name. It was really about saving my church money, but I named the company SaveYourChurchMoney.com, and it's an LLC. And so now I had gravitas, and so I would get with other manufacturers, I would get set up, and then over time, friends started, wanting me to help them. Pastors like that sound of saving money, and so I would help colleagues, but it was a hobby, it wasn't my business.
Sure.
We benefited from it, and that just kept happening over time. More and more.
This is why you're still pastoring, correct?
Yeah, this is why I'm still pastoring.
Right.
Yeah. So when we get to the point of transition, what am I going to do? I think I have a lot of friends around the country in ministry. One thing we know is there are lots of people who have stories like mine where they went to a church, God was good, God was gracious, they were really blessed, and then they can go and try to, here's what your church can do, or here's how we can, here's how your church can grow. One thing I know is there's plenty of people doing it. But there's nobody doing this who was a lead pastor, who went through this whole process, who can identify with small churches and medium-sized churches, and can offer advice in terms of the nuts and bolts stuff. So that's my niche. That's what I said I'm going to do, and I enjoy that. I enjoy that aspect of it, because I tell you one thing: when you're dealing with furnishings, it's very easy to be very objective, because you know what's good and you know what's going to fall apart. When you're talking about strategies the church should do,
sure,
there's more subjectiveness in that.
Yeah.
And I don't always want to be the guy to say, oh, this is what you should do, because I'm not sure that's what that pastor should do in his area. I was a superintendent of 30-some churches for about 8 years. I'd go in and out of those churches trying to help them, and I'd be at a loss sometimes to know exactly. I'd offer some good counsel. I'd pray for them. I'd give them some options. But to tell them what they should do was never something that I felt as confident with as I do when it comes to.
Sure. Well, see, we do vision days, which goes in and works with an individual church. And because the church makes an investment in it, I wanted to make sure we left them with a plan that they could implement no matter what, because, and I think pastors will understand me saying this, sometimes the pastor's the problem. Yeah. Sometimes the pastor, lack of training or lack of drive or whatever it may be, lack of motivation, lack of vision or mission, keeps the church back. And sometimes pastors will move on. Well, I didn't want them to make an investment in their vision day, and then the pastor leaves and it'd be gone. And so I get what you're saying, because sometimes, we have to come to grips with the fact that we don't know what we're doing. And there is no one size fits all anything.
And I just think, that need is filled by many people other than me. What I do is a little more specific, that isn't happening. So that's really what I decided to do. It just kept growing, word of mouth. One thing that's happened is interesting. There's some manufacturers that I've worked with now. Some of them I've worked with, for 17 years, and they know that. As an example, let's just say a church says, man, we want to pull these pews and we're going to need, 300 chairs. So now they start calling places on the web or sending in website inquiry forms. Well, some of those places sell direct, some of them sell through dealers. But one thing that a manufacturer will know is if they're getting contacted, probably all their competitors are.
Sure.
And so the manufacturer who doesn't sell direct has to say, well, I need to have somebody follow up on this. And they go, well, I'm going to have George follow up on it, because I know that he'll sell our product the most competitively against all these other manufacturers. Plus he talks the game. I mean, so to speak, he's been that's how they view me.
You were one.
Yeah. And so I mean, every week I probably, between different manufacturers, and there's one in children's, there's one in staging, there's other ones that we get. Any contact they get from a church or a religious institution of some type, they send me. I'll probably see 40, 50 leads a week that I do nothing to obtain. They just send them to me, knowing that we'll handle them. And so it gives us an advantage, in the marketplace. I don't do this. I mean, I make money, but I don't do this for a living. My church took care of my retirement. My wife is a retired teacher. We're in great shape. So we're able to do this. We're able to pass along savings to churches. But more importantly than that, we also can provide good counsel. And I just think, when I first started doing this, Dale, my idea was, hey, whatever you want, I'll just get it to you for less.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a win-win. Whatever you want, I'll get it to you for less.
Sometimes they don't know what they need.
But over time, I found that if they really wanted junk, there wasn't much point in me getting that junk for them for a little less, because they still thought I provided the junk. And so I tell churches, very few churches want a Cadillac, but there's a few that want a Cadillac. We can provide a Cadillac. Very few churches really, when they think about it, want a junker. They don't want to. We're old enough to remember Yugos, coming from those cars. I mean, most churches don't want a Yugo, but
you're gonna have to get a new example.
the problem is, on the website, this stuff looks good. The web it always looks good, and so a lot of churches will buy Yugos not thinking it's a Yugo. So we think in general 90% of churches want a nice Honda Civic or Honda Accord. They want something that isn't fancy, but will hold up, stand the test of time. They can get it fixed if they need to get it fixed. There's a warranty for it. And so that's where I focus on primarily for 90% of churches is what's the best value that will, not just short term, but long term. And
your first goal is just to give them counsel on what to go for. So here I am, I've come through the pandemic. Our church is beginning to stabilize. It's beginning to grow again. I have a need in some arena of my facility. Why should I call you first?
Well, I mean, if they call, if they contact, we're not going to start with, here's what we have for sale. Here's what we think you should get. We're going to start with, tell me about your use pattern. Tell me, is this stuff moved several times? Does it need to be stored efficiently? Are you portable? Different configurations. Just tell me about how this stuff is used. Is it in a first impressions area, or is it back behind the scenes where you want something to hold up, but you're not worried about the more first impression?
Statics.
So we're just going to work through helping me understand exactly what you're trying to accomplish, exactly how the product is going to be used, and then we'll make some suggestions, and we can make suggestions at different price points for you, because some places have just have no concept on what something costs today. And honestly, the market has changed tremendously since the pandemic. I mean, we're dealing with factors of ocean freight and supply chain issues that I could talk for hours about that stuff, how this has changed. But the hardest thing we do is, one of the hardest conversations I have is that church that bought 500 chairs 4 years ago, and now they want 200 more. And they find out where they're at today. It's a lot easier. It costs
as much for the 200 as it did for the 500.
It will. And it's a lot easier to have the conversation with the church that has never looked for chairs, and now they're starting to look for chairs. And now their context is more today. But we have that, and we explain it. And I was a teacher. I was a teaching pastor more than I was a preacher in many ways. I teach, I explain, and if what they do with it is up to them. We built some great friendships with that. I can't tell you how many times my conversations with pastors move away from furnishings to their church, what they're dealing with. Can I call you back, George, and ask you this? And, sure. And we end up praying together on the phone. And
with that in mind, you said you got lots of leads. What are you seeing as you talk to pastors right now just about their emotional state? What are you seeing?
Well, I think it's hard. It's hard not to see there's more discouragement than there once was. It seems like it's more common with pastors that we get talking about that. No, I would say, Dale, that with most pastors, unless we really have more of a lengthier conversation and to where they open up a little more, pastors are pretty good at everything's great.
Yep.
And so
fake till you make it.
Yeah, so I sense some things, but it's not like that just happens initially. But then if I am in enough of a discussion with them and lengthy discussion, I tend to get a little more vulnerability, and I tend to sense more discouragement, more uncertainty as far as, are we going to be able to do this? I mean, I keep, overall I hear giving is pretty much in line with budget, but that expenses are up. And so they're struggling with that aspect of it. You go ahead.
I'm just going to ask you this question. So you were in ministry all those years. You're retired age now. Your church is taking care of you. Why do you do this?
I think it's just me. Whether it's type A or whether it's, drive and so on. I was a 24/7 guy, I mean, it was my wife. We would go someplace, there'd be staff and others. And of course, I ended up talking about the church. We're always talking church. Yep. And she would say, George, do you have to do that everywhere we go? Does that, and she was right. She was right. And I will tell you, I'm much healthier now. I mean, I'm much healthier now, but it still gives me, I just can't imagine what I would do if I wasn't doing this. I mean, I used to lead a lot of trips overseas and do some of that. And I could do, there's a point where I could have done more of that, but I don't know that that's what I want to do in the future. You can only take so many personal travel trips. You can only play so many rounds of golf.
Yep.
I get to do that as I want to, but it's not as fulfilling as having a conversation. I mean, I played golf over the weekend. I did some things, but during that time, I was looking forward to this podcast because this has been my life, and I like this. I don't know if that's what your answer, but that's my answer.
No, I mean, your answer is, it is what it is. I mean, you do what you do because you do it. And I think the need is so great today. Pastors they have a lot of pressure. There's a lot of things weighing on them. And the last thing they, again, many weren't trained to do the practical sides of ministry. So having a trusted friend they can talk to like you is very helpful. Would you say that basically if someone reaches out to you, they're probably going to get about as good a deal, if I could say it like that, on stuff as if they went on their own somewhere?
Well, they will, apples to apples. Like if we're dealing with a specific apples to apples product, the chances of us being beat is less than 1%. It's just this. Now, but what places will do is they will just simply say, what we have is just as good as that.
Yeah, they quote something different.
And now we got apples and oranges, and they have to understand what that means.
Yeah.
And some swallow it, and some want to be educated on it. So we just do our best to help them and leave it's in some ways, it's kind of like the work I've always done as a pastor. I spread the gospel, I spread the seed. I've done my part. How people respond is up to them. With this, I'm communicating a totally different realm, obviously, in importance, but I'm communicating the same thing, and what they do with it is up to them. And as long as they, if they hear me out, and I have a guy just talked to last week, and I have every sense that he just has no money. And I told him, I said, there were times in my ministry where we knew we were going to have to get something that it might not be broken down within 3-4 years. But maybe you need to do that. I'm not saying absolutely, you should never do that. But if we can try to keep that from happening, then let's consider that.
Well, I know that in the day I told you about the chairs we had to buy. We couldn't afford anything. We needed at least 100 chairs, and all we could do is buy the Sam's Club version. But they didn't last. The screws fall out, and it's not designed for that kind of work. So here's the deal. We have hundreds of small and mid-sized church pastors that are listening today. And what I want them to understand is before you go and purchase anything or in the future, it's worth it to have to give George a call and just let him guide you. You can do what he says, or you can ignore him, which is the way life is. But George, as you think about the pastors today and what you're seeing, what we're dealing with out there, as we wrap up the podcast, can you just share a word of encouragement, wisdom, advice, or hope? If you were sitting down with a pastor having coffee today, what would you tell him?
I would tell them that, as I look back on my ministry and as I talk to pastors who preceded me and look back on their ministries, if they really want to, they can come up with things that they dealt with that were pretty significant, in terms of struggle, in terms of despair. I look back at some, if I get thinking about it, I look back at some of that and I go, wow, we went through that. We went through that. Yeah. And, but now with where I sit, unless I'm intentional about trying to think of the bad things, I don't think about them. I think about, would I do it again? I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Would I go through everything we went through? Sign me up. And that for them, that's the promise we have. We're faithful. Things work differently for different people. Over the years, I had dozens and dozens of pastors come and, George, what's your secret? What's your secret in a small town? How's this happen?
There's not one.
All I know is for whatever reason, God drew the hearts of people towards us. He was gracious to me. I'm grateful for it. But my prayer is I would have been just as faithful if that had not been happening for us. And that's our call. And so that's what I would tell the guys I worked with when they came then. That's what I would tell them today. It's outside of our control, a lot of this.
SaveYourChurchMoney.com. George Kreger. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And as you listen today, hey, if you're in any need in your church, in any arena, to purchase different things like that, would you take a moment and look up George? We'll have all the contact information in the show notes. But before you go, and especially if it's an area you don't know anything about, before you do that, I think we've introduced you today to a trusted friend who give you great advice. And so, George, thank you so much for your time, for joining us today. Thank you for your heart for the church. And thank you for taking this time when you could be playing golf. You're pouring it into churches and helping them, because, if they save money, if they spend less money on physical things like, furnishings, that frees up more money to do more ministry type things. And so I appreciate what you do.
Hey, it's been I'm glad we connected, Dale, and I look forward to having other conversations with you like this down the road. So,
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.